All right, I guess we are live and direct. Welcome, everyone. My name is Baba Israel, Artistic Director of the Performance Project. And welcome to a conversation with our artist in residence, Cyrus Aaron. So, hello, Cyrus. Glad to have you here. And
What's going on?
also,
What's going on?
great to have your collaborator as well, Laurent Chevalier, in the house.
What's up, brother? How
Welcome,
you?
Laurent in
Hey,
the building.
Laurent. How you doing? Welcome, welcome.
I'm good, man. I'm good.
Good. So, just to get started, Cyrus, we really grateful to have you as part of our artist in residency program. And just maybe to get started, I'd like to introduce both of you, hear a little bit about your individual arts practices, and then we can talk a little bit about how you all came together as collaborators, and then more specifically about the project that you're working on now. So, Cyrus, could you, just for folks who might be tuning in, folks who follow the performance project, but who maybe are new to your work, how would you describe yourself as an artist? What art forms do you work in? Where do you find inspiration from? Maybe who are some of the, mentors that may have guided you on your journey, maybe directly or just folks that have inspired you?
Mm. Yeah, it's hello and thank you for having me. It's to break the ice. It's so interesting doing these conversations on Zoom, but then also on Facebook, and all we see are each other. And so I just see Baba and Laurent. So I don't know who's here. I don't know who else I'm speaking to, but I know who I got in front of me, at least right
That's
now
right.
on the Zoom. And so Baba and Laurent, happy to be in the virtual room with you
Thank you.
at this present time. So Cyrus Aaron, creative storyteller. And that's, wherever words are, that's where I find myself. And so that's, thankfully, it's been theater, that's poetry, both in written form and spoken word. That's in film. I just wrote my first two short films this past year. And so those projects are in post production. I also write creative copy and manifestos for brands. And so I've had a little taste of that as well, to bring the art form into the corporate and marketing space. But really, for me, it's wherever I can be a vessel of humanity. My work pretty much is centered in trying to understand this existence, this experience, this quick like moment of time that we have and that we also share with one another as human beings. And so, as an artist, I'm a human first. And from coining from Toni Morrison, advocate of voice and doer of language. And
Mm,
for me, I think that voice represents who we are at our soul, at our core, and language is how we identify and locate ourselves with other people. And so my journey is just to find the balance between, or the alignment between, both voice and language.
that's no small task, and I
Not at
appreciate,
all. Not at
you
all.
know.
Many have tried and are continuing to try, but that's what we're here for, right?
No, it's a journey, but I'm curious because I like that you focus on this title of creative storyteller, and I think it's one of the things that actually defines us as human beings is the ability to we learn episodically, and our
Mhm.
memory is episodic. I mean, storytelling is how we actually pass on legacy, tradition. It's how we
Yep.
understand our own lives. So and scientists who study what makes us human, they're like, one of the things is we have episodic memory, and
Hmm.
stories are really how we retain. And I think it's beautiful that you work across these different art forms. And I'm curious how your work as a poet, how does that influence you as someone writing a screenplay or a theater piece? Are there ways that those distinct forms cross pollinate? And could you maybe just share a little bit of your thoughts around that?
Oh yeah, and I'm sure both you and Laurent can attest to this. I believe, kind of what Baldwin would say, that we're all kinds of poets, right? And I think at the root of poetry is simply just asking questions, examining things as they are, not necessarily to determine if they are better off or worse off, but just to be able to um, ask or find, more clarity in the question asking. Because we'll never have all of the answers, right? Because we only have what we have by proximity, by exposure, by experience. But they're just attempts. They're, darts at the board trying to just piece together, again, what this existence means. And so for me, having my origin or genesis in poetry, really it's just being open to the human experience that allows me to tap into narrative across mediums. And so I don't feel restricted or limited. And that's why I kind of open it up as creative storyteller, because I can exist in all these small lanes, but all these small lanes are essentially trying to grasp this much larger picture, right? And so I love being able to think about form and the disciplines uniquely, but at the raw of it all, it's really just about trying to make sense of the things that we go through on a daily basis.
Beautiful. And I love that, I don't know if these are folks that you consider inspirations, mentors. I would assume so, but I appreciate, the calling in of Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, just,
Oh yeah,
you know, two of the greats,
they are that
you know,
Mount Rushmore.
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
And, who we should continue to turn to,
Hmm.
for guidance, inspiration. And, I think I really appreciate also your commitment to curiosity,
Yeah,
because I think sometimes in artists, we feel like we have to have a final statement or a declarative statement when actually maybe sometimes it's just a question that we continue to explore. And there's something liberating about that. So
it
as an
is.
artist myself, I'm going to remind myself, we can just have a question and see where that takes us. So
Exactly. That's it,
yeah.
Baba. That is
I,
it.
I appreciate that. So Laurent, tell us a little bit about your art form, because I think, you're a storyteller in a different way. You have, maybe work in some different mediums, but maybe I'm curious to hear what, what your practice is. If, I have some sense of what art forms you work in, but may not know them all. So maybe introduce yourself to your performance projects audience and, yeah, share a little bit about your practice.
Yeah, glad to be here. Glad to be able to speak with both of you. I appreciate the chance, definitely. So yeah, my name is Laurent Chevalier. I am primarily working in photography as my medium. And I've kind of come to an understanding that observational photography is kind of how I've coined the way I work, because I started with very much like quote unquote street work, kind of slash documentary work, keeping a small camera with me all the time and just, capturing the things that I sort of came across in any sort of circumstance I found myself, whether I was traveling to somewhere, I just found myself somewhere. But that thread has kind of taken through all the ways that I've explored with photography. So even when I'm sort of crafting an image, whether it's, directing someone that's in it or whether I'm actually working on a set and, crafting an image in that way, it's all kind of stemming from things I observe and speaking to what Cyrus was mentioning is asking questions in that way. And so in my mind, there's a lot that we can learn if we just kind of take the time to observe the things that are going around us because like you mentioned, our memories are episodic, our knowledge is sort of episodic. And so that means there's a lot of information that we're constantly being informed by, that we're surrounded by, but we may not always realize exactly what that is. So that's I guess the method that I'm usually approaching. And then subject matter, I'm generally considering the idea of like Black interiority and the idea of, what is it to live these lives as Black people, particularly in the United States, because that's my background, that's what I know, that's what I understand, and that's what I'm trying to sort of continually unravel. And so I'm approaching that through different ways. Sometimes it's observing what the environments are and what they sort of imbue us with. Sometimes it's trying to strip away an environment and present as much of what the person presents of themselves. And so in all of that, kind of deciding how we clash together, how we crash together, how we mix, because it's
Mm.
world that kind of makes us all, who we are. So I use the camera to explore all of those elements. That's kind of how I approach. And it's funny, similarly enough, Toni Morrison's work and perspective inspires how I photograph as well, because I want to do it less from a state of response to an outside design or definition, and more sort of that's why I refer to it as interiority, is like looking from within and defining from the outside. I think she said something, she took the edge and she made it central. And so I think that's how I'm trying to
Mhm.
think about my photography as well. So yeah, that's how I consider it.
So sort of shifting and transforming, whose gaze we're dealing with, and who's, who's at the viewpoint, who's at the place of observation.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I had
Hmm.
a book that I released last year, and it was all street quote unquote photo work. And I was working in the vein very much like a lot of the old classic photographers that I'm certainly greatly inspired by stylistically and approach wise. But what I found was that often the voices that were very venerated, they weren't living within and they weren't a part of some of the communities that they made, honestly amazing images of, but they're still, I think the beautiful thing about photography is it's always containing perspective. And so
Yeah.
there's no way to divorce yourself from that when you're working in photography. So even if someone has the exact same materials as far as like camera and film and all that sort of thing, and they go to the exact same place at the exact same time, there will be a difference, even if it's not visually perceptible, because I think photography is always kind of a war of three perspectives. It's, the person making the image, it's the person receiving the image, and then there's a technical element of how the image is made. So that's why I think photography is particularly important and why I choose to practice in it continually.
No, and I think I appreciate that insight, and I think that we're in a time where our visual language is prominent and dominant in a lot of ways, and I think who's taking the picture, what their relationship is to that environment, has an impact. Sometimes it's pronounced, sometimes it's subtle. I'm curious how you develop your eye. I mean, I have some sense as someone who started in poetry myself. I've developed a relationship with words and language, and there's a sense of intimacy with language and all kinds of influences, whether it might be other poets, whether it might be songwriters, whether it might be music. There's different ways that I find into language. How do you feel? What are some of the ways that you've developed your eye as a photographer, and what is it, what sparks you, to capture a moment, to zone in on an observation? Like you said, sometimes it might be something that you've constructed, that you're directing. You might have a specific vision. Sometimes it might be more spontaneous. But I'm just curious if you could just talk a little bit about how you've developed your eye, your how you select shots, how you frame things.
Yeah, I think I have, ultimately I consider it the blessing of being self-taught as far as like my photographic practice. What that meant, I think, is that it's taken me a long time to kind of get to a point where I feel like I am making what I desire. But I think the benefit of that is that it's been a path. And so it's been a kind of consistent working at and developing and observing. And so a lot of it came out of me just making work over a long period of time and then kind of taking the time to go back at it and say, okay, now that I'm separate from the moments that I took this work and the immediacy of it, what is it that speaks to me? What is it that's something that sparks me? And then what are things that I maybe didn't even realize are continuing themes or continuing even framing choices or that sort of thing. And so you kind of like, it's like you can learn about yourself through your own work if you take the time to look back at it, I think. So that was very informative for me, kind of developing just how I shoot. And then, I mean, as far as how I shoot, it really depends on the method that I'm using. Because if I'm carrying my small camera with a wide lens, that usually kind of, I feel like capturing spontaneous, free, energetic moments in the environment. And I'm often less concerned about the perfection of the composition or
Mm.
specifically the lighting or anything, but more about, okay, what is it that's going on and what do I feel like I need to include? So once I learned the lens and knew where my lines were and my distance, then it's just about that. Like there might be a moment that sparks it, and then I'll consider everything that's surrounding it and figure out what's gonna sort of surround that moment. And then sometimes it might be a scene, and then I wait for a moment to occur. But then if I'm working with a larger camera, so I started working with like a view camera, that's an entirely different process because then I really have to, because of the slowness of the process, construct the scene before me. And so it's nice because the different tools cause me to work in different ways, and I think that's appropriate. Different tools are for different jobs. And so I think you should consider them all, in their proper context as well.
Beautiful. And I think I remember from the first time I met you, is there like a family legacy with photography? Is that, do I remember that correct?
Yeah, my grandfather was a photographer, and it's funny because I didn't know that when I first sort of took up photography. And it kind of begs the question is like, what is in
Right.
you, what is learned,
Hmm.
which is an interesting thing because he was, I didn't grow up like having him around particularly, so I kind of
Okay.
met him later in life. And then as we spoke, I realized that we had these similarities, we had these, sort of bonding things that brought us together. And yeah, he was a photographer in Chicago for many years. He had a lot of equipment, and once he saw that I was kind of more serious about it, he it seems I feel that he saw that I actually had a heart for it, and that was when he really kind of opened it up to me as far as like, let's talk about what you do, let's talk about what I did, and let's talk about these technical processes, and let's talk about these theoretical processes and that sort of thing. So yeah,
That's
it
a
was
beautiful moment.
in me before
Yeah.
I knew, which is interesting.
Well, that's a
Yeah,
beautiful
that's
moment too.
the.
When, yeah, go ahead,
I
please.
was gonna say that's a Laurent. You said a few things, and Baba, this is pretty much how Laurent and I kick it on a on a regular basis. We just chop it up and theoreticize and just just go there. Um, but I think having the heart for something and then having the time for something, I think that's what shapes us as artists, right? Where
Yeah.
it's like even with Laurent's, grandfather being able to say he has the time, he has the attention to it, but then once he has that heart for it, which then, as he already mentioned, as far as like what shapes, his practice, I think is what shapes all of our practice, is by being able to really sit to understand what does something mean to me.
Mm,
And there's, to your point, there's so many images out, especially with the advent of social media. Everyone's taking photos, everybody's writing motivational messages or words of affirmation. But then at what point in time does it become specific and unique to you as the author, as the
yes.
photographer, right? Like, when is it not for just other people? And it requires, the heart, which requires the commitment, which requires the patience, which requires the, endurance to go with the ebb and flow, the ups and downs of this process of just gaining a little bit more clarity of our unique voices, whether that and whatever seasons that clarity, that specificity comes in, because sometimes we do feel that we're in the gray, heads in the clouds, really just trying to get to a place, and the corner doesn't turn quite when we want it to, but we're still in it for that path and still in it for those moments. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that quickly in there.
No, I
But
appreciate that. And the word that kind of popped in my head, and then I'll pop back to you, Lauren, was also something about commitment. There's something about that in order to stay on that journey requires commitment,
Hmm.
and that leads to longevity, which then leads to the ability to reflect on work, as both of you have mentioned, and then that allows for the honing of a practice and the growth of your own voice. Laurent, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
I was just going to add, it makes me think of probably my favorite quote from Miles Davis that he said, it takes a long time to sound like yourself. And
Hmm.
like that's so true because it's, when you start, you're working off what you've seen. And so, you're very often trying to reach the heights that someone else has, grasped or set. But, the heights are there, but you got to find your own path to get there. And if you're following their path, it's going to take a little time for you to kind of get off of that and then say, okay, this is the way that I want to go. Even if I want to go the same place they're going, I got to find my own way. So I love that quote, and I think it's particularly helpful, especially in this time where things move so fast and people have so
Yes.
many expectations, and people also have so many opportunities to compare. At one point, the images that you might have seen would be if you went to a museum or you bought a book or somebody came and showed you their images, but now we're inundated, and so it's very easy to throw yourself into a fray and not know who you are in the fight.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. I think that's essential, and I think I really like, and it's also for me exciting to hear a photographer quoting a musician, and we can take inspiration from artists of different disciplines, and it makes me think. I don't know if you're familiar with the singer Toshi Reagan, and wonderful singer songwriter. She also did some theater work and musical work. But I remember I saw her sing the song and I was completely floored by it. And I went up to her after the performance and I thanked her for it. And she said, "I've been singing this song 20 years and I feel like I'm just starting to get to know it." you know.
Yeah.
And I think it's helpful, I think, for artists to remember that because we are in this, just grinded out, instantaneous, and it's funny. I walk around the city now and I see everywhere looks like a photo shoot. I see it just, everyone seems to be
Everywhere.
every block there's like a person either by themselves or with a friend, creating some content, and
Hmm.
and I'm sure there's a lot of different reasons, intentions. I have one more question for you, from Laurent, and then I'd like to segue a little bit into your how you all came together as a collaboration. But I'm curious, when in my experience working with photographers over the years, observing, there's some photographers who are invisible. You don't know they're there, and that's part of their magic, is that they really are almost invisible and they capture things because they are not there. And then there's some photographers who really are interactive, and their energy and the way that they interact really helps to shape and create shots. And I'm curious, do you lean in one direction? Do you play with both? What have you discovered in terms of your presence and how your presence contributes to photography?
I would say that I generally lean toward the not there, because I'm often very interested in, what is happening independent of me as much as possible, because I think that there's a lot, like I mentioned, there's a lot that we can learn from the occurrences that are already happening. So if I can find a way to, as closely as I can, preserve an element of that moment and present it, I think there's a lot of value in that. But I think as I've kind of continued to grow in my practice and everything, you recognize that your presence is a part of that, and it inherently adds and changes moments. And so you can get close to trying to preserve a moment as fettered as you can. But the reality is, your presence is part of the perspective in many ways. And so I've kind of grown to more understand that element, I think, and to lean into the idea that, okay, this is also a dialogue when you're creating a photo in a space, and particularly if you're creating a photo in a space with a person present, whether they're aware of you or not, there is this sort of dialogue that's happening, and they're presenting themselves and you're presenting yourself, and then the photo is kind of what happens between those two, facades, if you will. So yeah, I think I still lean toward the observational, but I'm growing to expand, I guess, my perspective in that regard.
Beautiful. So how did you all come together? Where who either of you could begin, but I'm just curious, how did you develop this collaboration? How did it emerge?
Who was it that first?
Yeah.
I forget who it was.
Uh, was
You?
it? Well, I reached out, but I think it was. I'm trying to think of the year. Was it like 2015, 2016?
Yeah, something like that.
Um, yeah, and a part of my like impetus to connect with Laurent in the beginning was my desire for community amongst artists. Um, and that also represents itself here, in the work of Still in Motion. I think it's very important, because artists tend to be, it's very easy for us to fall into our isolations, and to your point of invisibility versus visibility. A lot of us will, lean to the side of being the invisible man. And so, I, because of because of social media, Instagram, it was Laurent and a few other photographers' works that even outside of my medium, I was like, it's necessary to build some bridges. And so hit up a friend who connected and gave me this information. I reached out, and then we just like linked up and grabbed a beer, and ended up just chopping it up for what might have been, a couple of hours, and immediately seeing, that kindred spirit, that brethren of the soul. And so we've just been building, since then, in communion and friendship, and artistically in support and agency of one another. And we've collaborated a few times, several times in over the past, 4 or 5 years that we've been connected. And so, yeah, this is the brethren right here.
That's
This
beautiful.
is yeah.
That's a beautiful reflection. Laurent, I'll in a moment ask you to give your sort of reflection, but I just, for any artists who are watching or who will watch in the future on YouTube, wherever this lives and lands, I just want to underline the importance of artists building community and building, because art forms can, particularly writing, can often be isolated. You can often deal with a lot of isolation, And there's something very powerful when you find like-minded artists who you can support each other and with real integrity. And I just wanted to, I know for me, collaboration is essential. And
Hmm.
at a certain point, it's like I need other voices, I need other art forms, other skills to co-create. And I know, and so I just wanted to affirm that, encourage artists, and I think it's also beautiful if you see someone that you appreciate and
Yeah.
that is inspiring you, like reach out, because sometimes we can feel unsure of reaching out, but
Mm.
often artists like to feel appreciated, and like to feel like their work is having an impact,
Right.
and
That
a
we
lot
do.
can, yeah, a lot can grow from that. So I just wanted to underline that impulse that you followed, which has led to a multi-year long-term collaboration and a friendship.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that I just wanted to underline that. So Laurent, any reflections on your coming together with Cyrus?
Yeah, it's a kind of, it's a, I mean, that's definitely accurate. And I think at that point in my photographic career, I'd already started to realize I certainly wanted to be serious about it. But I think I was just starting to get more of an understanding of like my voice and what I wanted to do with it. And so then in meeting someone who I could speak to and who had a different medium, and as we spoke, we realized like, okay, we're like thinking about a lot of the same things, considering a lot
Hmm.
of the same things, and like making some of the same observations, and realizing that this could be a cross medium, dialogue, was really, really cool. And then I remember what was nice too is like I remember we met, we hung out, we had a real good talk, but I hadn't seen his work, at that point really, and that was an interesting thing. Like, he had seen photography, so he kind of like had an idea of like at least what I did with my work, but I hadn't seen his work yet. So I was like, all right, man, he was really cool. But I kind of got to see it because I know
We got to know.
I've had conversations with people where I'm like, man, I love what they're talking, and then I see the work and I'm like, but it just doesn't quite get
Mm.
like, and I respect it and we can build, but like, and then I remember going to see his play someday, and I saw the play and I was like, oh, okay, the intention is matching the effort and it's matching the output, and
Nice.
it was like very refreshing because it was like, all right, now I know that we're right here, and
Hmm.
not only on what we think about, but also like the approach that we take to execute. Because I think that's a huge thing too. There are people who I, respect and like how they consider and what they're considering, but we just have different
Yeah.
means or manners of approaching a solution to that, artistically. And so to see someone who is like, okay, that vibes with how I think and how I want to communicate how I think. That was like that was the seal of the deal. Like, all right, cool, we good, we be
No,
brothers.
that's
Yeah.
beautiful. No, it's true, because it can get awkward, right? It can get awkward when it's like great conversation. You go see the
We've
show
all
and you're
been
like,
there.
I'll be in touch.
We've all been there. We've all
Absolutely.
been there.
No, and not everyone is aesthetically compatible.
Yeah.
True.
And
Yeah.
but it's great, but it's grateful when you feel that resonance. And I'm just curious, what stood out about Cyrus's work as a playwright? Was it in the language, in the performance, in the subject matter, all of the above? Do you remember what some of the things that stood out to you about that play?
It was the subject matter, and also it was the element of subtlety being
Mm,
included in it, in that it
Mm.
wasn't, because that's, and part of it I think is probably just my personality. I'm a very kind of like generally even keel, and I like to kind of consider things, and I generally consider myself fairly measured in many ways.
mm,
And I felt like there was a real like consideration in the work that he was doing that considered the subtlety of all the things that were in play, and it wasn't just kind of like a one note hammer over the head of like, this is blackness, you know what I mean? But it was like going through all the consideration. I could feel the considerations he was making and
right.
feeling that there was layers to that. And that was refreshing because I think especially then, that was what, 2015, 2016, something like that.
Yeah.
um, there was a lot of work coming out, and frankly, I mean, it's still a similar environment, I think, where people were making a lot of work that was responsive to outside impetus,
Right.
outside protest and killings, and like, there was so much going on, and some of it was very much kind of a loud one note voice, that I felt didn't really truly give service to all the complexities of the experience. And I felt like his work did a much better job in like doing that. And so that was like the thing. I was like, okay, I get that.
That's beautiful. Like, yeah, the word complexity, nuance, right? Layered, and also I think there's something, what is the work and what is the voice outside of just a state of reaction? And I think that word that you used before, was it interiority,
Yeah,
right? Like that allows for something else to rise and come forth.
exactly. Because the
So
way I think about it is, we are without a definition, and though we may receive definitions and have definitions put upon us, we still already are. And so, what is that when it's not being pointed at? What is it when it's reflecting or shining out?
beautiful.
Mhm. Feeling at them nuances, man. You got to.
Yeah. No, that's important, and in a way, I think because this hasn't been necessarily a nuanced time that we've been living through the past few years, that there has been a
Mm,
lot of sense of urgency, immediacy, intensity, and how do you carve out space to deal with nuance in a moment like this, where it feels like an all-out assault,
Hmm.
in so many ways. But I appreciate your commitment to that as artists together. So take us into Still in Motion. So this is your current collaboration, and the one that you're working on it with Performance Project. Tell us a little bit about how this specific project is emerging, and I know it has a really specific focus around neighborhood, around place, and I wonder if you can both just comment a little bit about Still in Motion, and then in a little while we'll take a look at some images.
yeah. It's a I guess a child of the imagination, but also a child of you know personal practice to where um, again, community just really means so much to me, and a part of how even my art has shifted in the past few years, like moving to New York in 2010, and then working on the corporate side, and then ditching that to finally tap into and to fully pursue art 5 years later, and understanding the so many shifting dynamics and life experiences. Now we live so many lives within what feels like such short periods of time, but understanding that community was just really, really important. And then what is community? It's shared investment, shared values, it's shared interest, and seeing how I wasn't presenting myself to the community in which I lived in, where I was essentially just using it for space, for a place to lay my head, but I didn't interact as much with my neighbors. I interacted with um, other creatives, other young New Yorkers who were just on the move, trying to make sense of what it means and what it looked like to live in New York. And so as I began to get very intentional about forming bonds and relationships, this idea of creating art that reflected where I live and where I am, kind of began to take form and shape, and connecting with Laurent and really other really really just who I feel to be dope photographers, figuring out how do we begin to collaborate and work hand in hand together, in not only reflecting voice but also shaping voice. And so Still in Motion was this this imagined this undertaking where I wanted to um, capture you know who um, who people were in a specific community, and then also just give them a little bit more voice. So taking the idea of taking an image and really trying to understand what's happening in that moment, what's happening around us, on a societal level, and giving that text, giving that language, and then figuring out how to present that to an audience. So it's a completely collaborative piece that takes the photography that Laurent has sat with Bed-Stuy, specifically Bronzeville neighborhoods, Fort Greene within Brooklyn, and then giving narrative language to that, and then also incorporating a bit of theatrical practice. And so there will be a desire for there to be choreography as well. And so leaning on some dancers that I know to begin to embody the image in a way. And so it's just this full collaborative piece that takes, lives, that are, very real, very tangible, very present, and offers an interpretation and translation of the voice of the people that we see in the frame.
Beautiful. I really appreciate that. And then Laurent, your role has been to do that capturing, that documentation. How has that experience been? Are you also do you live in the same area in Brooklyn, or you live in another part of Brooklyn? Are you also in that area?
Yeah, so I live in the same area in Brooklyn, and it lined up well with what Cyrus wanted to do when he mentioned this because I often carry my camera with me at all times, and it kind of I've over the years been documenting the neighborhood and the people in it and that sort of thing, and experiencing the circumstance that everyone's in, and so it worked out well in that regard because I already was doing that, and so it kind of just gave me a chance to continue that, and then also expand like what I was considering. And it's interesting because as he and I were talking, I was talking about how at this point I was thinking a lot about the environment of the space, and how that sort of shapes the experience of the people within the space. So not necessarily always looking at what is the person doing in the frame, or what is the activity that's happening, but really considering like, okay, what is it? Obviously this space is brought to life by the people that are here, so what is the space bringing, or refining, or what is it limiting, and how is it impacting the lives that the people have here? So the space kind of constrains in certain ways, but it's also a foundation upon which all these lives are built. So that was how I was considering going through these images, and thinking of places and times and spaces and the meeting of both people and environment. So that was how I was thinking about these particular images.
Beautiful. Well, let's experience some of them. I think we're gonna invite our live audience and any audience that will watch this in the future. Let's take them into the folder. Let's take them behind the scenes a little bit. So I'm gonna ask Cyrus, if you don't mind, we're just gonna open up a folder and look at a few images, and we can maybe discuss a few, and then we can just round off. So one thing I noticed is that you're working in black and white, and I'm just curious, um, what motivated that choice, and maybe talk a little bit about that aesthetic choice and that visual choice.
Yeah, I've been interested in black and white because of the kind of forced simplicity in a way, and then also what I've been thinking about kind of more recently as to why I like black and white is the interesting thing about photography is there's always been this consideration of like truth, and the kind of the idea that like a photograph is more true than a painting because it's mechanically capturing what's already there. But when you realize, kind of like what I was mentioning earlier, the truth is very defined at that moment by the perspective of the person making it and the perspective of the person receiving it. And so a photograph can be informative, but it can also be misleading. It can contain a lot of elements that can help you understand a situation, but it can also contain elements where if you don't know, you'll actually be more confused, or lend yourself into a direction farther down, or even just how you interpret it. It could be one particular set of information in a photograph, but depending on what you bring to the image, that determines what you receive from it. So black and white kind of heightens that because it creates this separation between you know the world as we see it and the world as it's seen in the photograph. And I think it gives a chance to realize like, okay, this is a moment that occurred certainly, but it is not the experience of the full life and context of that moment. So it kind of creates that little bit of break, I think, and takes it a little bit out of time, since a photograph itself is taken out of time. So yeah, that's one of the reasons I like black and white photography.
Beautiful. Yeah, let's cycle through some of the images. And if either of you have any specific comments or reflections. I mean, it's amazing how iconic, some of these images for me, as someone who's grown up in New York, spent the early part of my life in Brooklyn. There's they feel essential in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm always curious what, especially when getting to work with someone and passing them photos, because the way we kind of worked was, I was passing photos along to Cyrus, and then he's kind of pulled out the ones that he felt were, particularly informative or, sparked something. And so I'm always curious what that process is like for him, because that's I think the beauty of it is it's kind of manifesting the realization of that difference in perspective. So I'm curious if there's any that he wanted to kind of talk about as to why it was he would pull this one to sort of speak to.
Yeah, that would be great, Cyrus. If maybe you can share like what makes you choose, out of all these beautiful images, where is your eye trained, and what are you looking for? Do you have something premeditated, or is it more of a intuitive response when it comes across your eyes?
Yeah, I think it was just more so, you know, fundamentally what spoke to me in consideration of if we take in like when this project will be done, like we're in and still in the hands of this pandemic, right? And so when I'm thinking about still in motion and how do you translate, the still image to then give it, legs, to give it, breath and to give it life, thinking about um, how our lives for a significant period of time were stopped, right? And so we were, essentially stopped in our tracks. So we were stuck in a frame. And so I really looked at the images that gave a sense of transition, gave a
Mm.
sense of purpose, gave a sense of journeying. And so most of the images are, you see there is physical movement. And then for the images like this, the transitory message of this is, it's a light pole, so it represents the intersection. And so then the question becomes, with George Floyd on the flyer here on this street light, what is this the intersection of? And so if as I'm thinking about the intersection of the pandemic, the intersections of protest, the intersections of the battle between left and right, Republican and Democratic, an election, all the things that were taking place in this current time are informing me to really settle on the Laurent's images that really speak to where we are, but speak to also where we can potentially be going, or what, to Laurent's point, of where we might have been restricted from going. And so, what does this corner represent in the time frame of a 2020, a 2021, a 2020, a 2022, when we'll do the culminating project? And so that's really what I was looking for, and really what spoke to me. And so now I'm in the process of, giving language and thinking about, what sounds are in these images. And this is one of my favorites, with the young man riding on the street, and then you have an image like this. The TV kind of carries over. So the frame earlier with the TV, the old school TV, sitting on the corner of that street, and then how that TV, though not the same, it was very interesting that he had another image with children playing on the TV. And so there's a reinvention of space and time, right? And so I loved some of the connectivity that led itself, obviously through creative interpretation, in his images, even though they were distinctly separate, and they're capturing, two different times, two different blocks, two different, moments, but there's still a usage, there's still a continuation of story here.
And it's funny, it really looks like the same type of TV, funny
It
enough.
Yeah,
does, right? Right.
yeah.
But I
Because
think that's
So
beautiful.
it,
Yeah, please, Laurent, go ahead.
I remember when looking at that earlier image of the TV on the corner with the broken screen, at that point when I came back to it, I was thinking about just like all the moments that that TV witnessed, right? Like, the children
mhm.
Saturday morning, and, the sports games and that sort of thing. And that at one point that TV was probably a prized possession that, someone saved up for, or, it wasn't like they just popped up and had it, but it was, something that they sought, something that they hoped for, something that
Hmm.
they placed some dreams in. And then they lived with it for some time and provided this utility and this service in this way, place of gathering and that sort of thing. And then you see it in this completely different environment being sort of, cast out and discarded, and just wondering about that journey from not being in the house and being desired to the point where it had to then be passed on to this, left open space. But then something like this kind of serves as like a late midpoint, because it's still being utilized as this place of play and gathering and space, and another interpretation. And it's, kind of like even children, how free they are to interpret something. Obviously this TV was not put out for them to play on, but they reinvented its purpose in that moment. So I'm very excited to see the way that Cyrus brings language to some of those thoughts and those things that we'd already been talking about, and then the things that he is able to see that, maybe I was considering and I didn't even know how to vocalize. So I think that's the beauty of the play between literary text and visual communication.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just from the way, Cyrus, the way you were kind of just riffing on these images, I think it gives us an insight into your process and the kinds of themes you're exploring and what we might expect, which is exciting.
Yeah.
How far are you now? Like, are you starting to construct text? Have you drafted uh, fragments, pieces? Is it what kind of language is it taking a certain form? Is it
Yeah.
poetic? Is it monologue? How do you see this emerging?
So right now it's looking like a balance of poetry, which in and of itself can be considered a monologue. But I am looking closely at some of the images that have multiple people in them, and looking considering what that dialogue could be, especially when it comes to the youth. I think as we talk about, taking up space, I chose some of the imagery with the youth because they too have an experience. They too are on a path and a journey, even though they may not, be the strongest voices in the neighborhood. They're still there. They're still living. They're still trying to figure out certain questions that they have. And so that's a bit of a challenge to myself to make sure that I'm giving room to them. But right now, like I say, between poetry and the spoken word, and then also just monologues, that's looking like that'll be the main core of the text. Whether or not that the poetry is and the spoken word is performed, on stage and live, or whether it's voiceover, still tossing ideas around of how I want it to be presented. But those would be the main two. And then some of these, like I said, I'm considering dance numbers and reaching out to some choreographer and dancer friends to kind of come in and put their interpretation on it as well. And so maybe the television is a centerpiece from a set standpoint.
Mm.
And then you have these, this movement that then comes in and speaks to a language of, that reinvention, that evolution of place, time, subject, body, object, and seeing where that interpretation leads us. And so then that means also thinking about sonically, like what is that? What's the score of that? Is what genre of music, what instrument sounds, can depict or very cohesively translate these moments. So I'm excited for it because there's so much that can be done, but I definitely want there to be a thread as I weave these pieces together.
Beautiful. No, I really appreciate you taking the time to, give us a little window into your process. And, for anyone
Yeah.
tuning in or tuning in the future, we'll be able to let you know when the culmination happens and when you share this work in the new year in 2022. So, there's a lot of rich inspiration here to pull from, and I'm excited to see how you're going to interpret and respond. Um, we just have a couple of minutes left. So one thing I want to highlight is stay tuned and, keep your keep your awareness open for announcements of when the Still in Motion will actually culminate as a live event, and we'll be spreading the word about that on the Performance Project social media channels and e-blast. So definitely stay tuned and listen out for that. But maybe to close, I really want to circle back to some of the impetus for this project around this sense of neighborhood and community, because I think it's something that I think a lot of people struggle with in New York. Like, some people feel a real sense of being embedded and, of having history, and having, some people feel like they have too much community and they can't get any privacy, but I'm curious for you, how has this project actually changed, or has it changed your daily relationship with your neighborhood? Are there new relationships, friendships, just even a sense of how you move through your neighborhood? I'm just curious for either of you, just to close, maybe a closing statement on how you're noticing this project is it shifting your lived experience on a day-to-day basis?
I'll jump in then. I would say for me, um, yes and no in some ways. In that I think I've lived in Brooklyn now since 2007, and so I think through photographing it, it's given me a great opportunity to experience it in a different way, and then also to look back on my experiences of it and how I see it and how I sort of navigate it. But I think what's been interesting for me is, so like I mentioned, I had a book that came out last year, and it was focused on the Black experience in New York. And so kind of once I finished that book, I thought, okay, maybe I can now, like, do other things and work on other like ideologies. But what I realized was I really kind of wanted to kind of just go deeper into that, and maybe just take a different approach visually. And so I think this project has given me that opportunity and realization that I'm very much interested in the idea of neighborhood and place, and how much that shapes who we are, and what we sort of become, and what our experience is as well. Because neighborhoods and places can be very complicated, especially in places that are primarily black and brown, because often that comes with these socioeconomic issues. But then there's also this sort of voyeurism that can happen, and then in most major cities, and certainly in New York, you've got this shifting elements of neighborhood, different people coming in, and then just thinking about all of those things kind of swirling together in play. And then also, there's black folk that come in but aren't part of the neighborhood. So what is their experience like? The folks who have been there for a while, what is their experience like when when they're interacting with someone like that? And then you have, white folk coming into neighborhoods that are primarily black and brown. What is that experience like? And the different ways that people navigate that. You
Yeah.
see people take different approaches. So this has just, I think, given me an opportunity, and it's helped chip away at my realization that place is very important to me. And exploring and looking into the place that I'm in helps give me a greater context to how I view the world and how I consider my place sort of all over.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that reflection.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to close this out, Cyrus, how have you noticed a shift in how you move through your neighborhood and how you interact with your neighbors?
Yeah, I think this project, again, for me, it just speaks to my um, my own personal charge, of really taking the time to listen, to really look at what's happening around community, and then being active in it. And to Laurent's point, when you consider the disenfranchised communities, you consider ownership, equity within the community. There's all these layers that we should consider and look at. So how do we empower each other, and how do we empower each other even without necessarily dictating the direction of a community, even without having the board control over what happens next for a community. um the past and the future of a community may not have an impact at all on the present circumstance of the community, or even within the present circumstances, people are still living, and so they're still creating and choosing and deciding with what they have, and with what they can work with. So I'm just always listening, And I think it's the many conversations that I both kind of eavesdrop into, and then those that I insert myself into, and then those that I am able to, very clearly participate and have with people, coming across all those different tracks of how we all ended up, in the same place. That just continue to inform, me and my work, and how do we as Black artists gain, acquire, scale, strategize to have more authority and an ownership and equitable standpoint in the communities that we live in and also create from. That's so key. So it's just a part of my evolution, I'd say, for sure.
Beautiful. I appreciate all that you have shared today, and Laurent, it's really very moving to see your images. So thank you for allowing us into the behind the scenes of the process, and I'm just amazed at the way light shows up in your work. And I think the black and white, actually, there's something about it, the way it allows us to focus on the interplay of light, which and also architecture, is something that really stood out to me, and how that creates, the frame for the human experience. So I feel a lot of gratitude for you all taking this time, and I think we consider this an invitation to stay tuned and to come in and experience the work when it comes to fruition, and when this stillness takes motion, through movement, through word, through
Bar.
sound. Yeah, there you go. No doubt. So thank you to Cyrus, thank you to Laurent, thank you to Emma Rivera, our space and production manager, always making things happen. And so thank you for your support tonight. And we'll check back in with you, and look forward to announcing when this work is ready, and just sending a lot of enthusiasm, encouragement, and look forward to more conversations and any way that we can support.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
All right.
Good conversation.
Thank you very much for tuning in. Peace to you, Cyrus and Laurent, and we'll talk again soon. Peace.
Peace.
Peace.